Yaqut had 3 sheets of parchment left, and the tower beneath him hadn't stopped shaking since dusk. Most people assume a great library dies by fire. Nobody expects it to drown, but in this city, the river was about to do something no flame ever could. There was also a vault in the palace nobody but the Caliph was allowed to open. By the time this night is over, every coin inside it will still be exactly where he left it. He will not be. This is the last night of the city that once held the world's knowledge. By the end, he won't think about libraries or rivers or gold. The same way again, a calligrapher copying scripture while the tower cracks beneath him. A river turning black, then red. Within the week, 12 days now. That's how long the mist over the Tigris had carried 2 smells instead of 1. Underneath it, the warmth of cedarwood smoke from the bakers' ovens. The smell this city had woken up to for 5 centuries. Over it, something new. Boiling sulfur, raw petroleum. The army outside the walls was cooking fire, not bread. Inside the Mustansiriya madrasa, oil lamps still burned amber over rows of scribes who kept copying anyway. One of them was Yaqut al-Musta'asimi, once a Greek slave, castrated as a boy. He had risen by nothing but the precision of his hand, all the way to the Caliph's own secretary. He cut his reed pen at a slant nobody had tried before. It made his letters lean, alive, unmistakably his. Tonight, he wasn't at his desk. He climbed the minaret instead, away from the screaming below. He carried his ink. He carried his pen. He carried nothing else. Baghdad had survived sieges before. A change of rulers in 945, another in 1055. Each time, the city bent and kept its shape. Nobody inside the walls had a reason yet to believe this time would be different. We'll come back to him. First, the walls and the men who let them crack. By the 11th day, the engineers outside had outrun their own supply lines. The quarried stone meant for the siege engines never arrived. So they improvised. They uprooted the date palm groves that had fed this city for generations and cut the trunks into projectiles. When even those ran short, they pulled apart the gravestones of Baghdad's own dead and fired them back over the walls. Every impact was someone's orchard, someone's harvest, someone's grandfather turned into a weapon against the people who had buried him. Inside the Mustansiriya, the great water clock kept its own rhythm through all of it. Bronze birds dropped metal balls into resonant bowls, marking each hour with a sound nobody could unhear. It didn't know the difference between an ordinary morning and the end of an empire. It just kept counting. The cracks had started long before the first stone hit a wall. Weeks earlier, refugees from the farmland outside the city had flooded in, carrying hunger and a sickness nobody had a name for. The dead piled up faster than anyone could bury them. Eventually, the city stopped trying. Families began carrying their own dead to the riverbank and letting the Tigris take them instead. The river had already learned to carry away what Baghdad couldn't hold on to. That wouldn't be the last thing it carried. The Caliph did not. Al-Musta'sim had a treasury vault few men were permitted to enter. His generals begged him to open it, pay soldiers, repair the walls, buy time. He refused. He preferred his gold and his collection of exotic birds to stay exactly where they were. Whatever was coming, he was certain his name alone would stop it. His own court was already at war with itself. The vizier wanted to send tribute, beg for terms. The military commanders called that treason. They accused him of gutting the garrison on purpose. 80 men in every 100 quietly dismissed in the years before the siege. Neither side trusted the other enough to save the city together. Then came the final letter. It didn't ask. It told the Caliph to tear down his own ramparts and walk out in person, or be hunted down from the sky itself. The Caliph wrote back with insults. Beautiful ones, useless ones. 3 days left. There was a gap in the wall nobody had bothered to seal. Across the city, the musician Safi al-Din al-Urmawi sat with his household, listening to the same impacts everyone else heard. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for his lute, the only thing he owned that might still be worth something to whoever walked through his door. The horses outside hadn't slowed. They never did. Back to Yaqut. He never came down from the minaret. The air below had changed. Blood now. And something burning that wasn't wood. Even the call to prayer had changed. It used to ring out full and certain, 5 times a day from every minaret in the city. Now it came thinner each time. Fewer voices, longer gaps between them, so he stayed, alone, copying lines of scripture by a single lamp, while the masonry under his knees kept losing pieces to the impacts below. He climbed. He sat. He kept writing. He would survive the night. He was one of the very few who did. By spring, the same conquerors who had cracked the stone beneath him would be paying him to keep copying. Families across the city were doing their own version of the same thing, believing, quietly, that this was survivable. Baghdad had bent before and kept its shape, so they hoarded flour, oil, dried dates, and waited behind locked wooden doors. Then arrows came over the walls, carrying a different kind of message. Safety for Christians, for Jews, for anyone who laid down their weapons. Some families marked their own doors in chalk and believed it. They believed waiting was a plane. It wasn't. The promise of mercy did exactly what the Mongols had built it to do. It talked the city out of fighting back as one. Hours before dawn, the gates opened. The population disarmed and assembled outside the walls, as ordered. Soldiers broke down every door that hadn't already opened on its own. The families who had gathered in churches and caravanserais certain that stillness would save them, found soldiers hunting them across the rooftops instead. What happened there ran down through the clay gutters and into the streets below. Far more than they could hold. In the days that followed, the House of Wisdom was emptied of everything except its shelves. Soldiers who valued gold and silk had no use for leather-bound philosophy. They tore the gilded covers off their sandals and left the naked pages behind, and carted them to the river's edge. Students who had hidden nearby watched the first load tip into the water. It took 5 seconds for the ink to bleed. 5 seconds for Aristotle, Euclid, Al-Khwarizmi, copied and recopied across 3 languages to survive this long. 5 seconds to understand none of it was coming back. Then the blood reached the same current. The river hadn't chosen black. Black was just what centuries of ink looked like, dissolving all at once. Then, silence. Not peace, exhaustion. The siege engines stopped because there was nothing left in range to break. The army that had been roaring outside the walls for 12 days pulled its camp back miles upwind. The smell of the city had become unbearable, even to the men who'd caused it. The handful who survived the streets were hiding wherever they could, in wells and sewers, behind false walls. They went days without food or clean water, waiting for a silence that meant safety. It didn't. It meant plague instead. A city that had once funded the world's finest scholars and physicians had gone quiet in a way it never had before. 10 days more. That's how long the Caliph had left after he walked out through his own gates and surrendered everything. His city, his army, his name. Guards marched him to a small village outside the walls he'd refused to repair. There, in front of him, soldiers stacked his treasury into a mountain. Every coin from the vault he'd never opened for the men who'd begged him to. Every coin, still there, exactly where he'd left it. He was not. They wrapped him in a thick wool rug and sewed it shut. Mongol custom forbade spilling royal blood on open ground. It would offend the earth itself. Then the cavalry rode over him, again and again, until the only sound left was bone. A resident watching through a crack in his shutter heard it before he understood what it was. He never told anyone exactly what it sounded like. Some things don't translate into words. That's the part of this story that never stopped happening. Not the engines, not the horses. People with extraordinary minds convinced themselves that brilliance was its own kind of war. Baghdad had the finest scholars and the deepest libraries on earth. And somewhere inside that magnificence, it forgot that ideas don't stop cavalry. They never have. We still make the same mistake, mistaking how impressive something looks for how protected it actually is. The difference now is we've watched this story end before. Next week, a city that survived 100 years of war, undone by a smell nobody could name, rising from its own well.